Have you ever stood at a crossroads where every step could mean life or death, not just for you, but for someone who's already lost everything? In the summer of 1885, deep in the unforgiving Arizona territory, a woman was left to die under the punishing sun, abandoned by her own people, the vultures circling closer with every hour. And then, a stranger appeared. If you were that stranger, would you turn away to save yourself? Or would you risk your own safety to save hers? It's a question that cuts deeper than courage. It asks what kind of heart you carry inside. This is not just a story of survival. It's about two broken souls who found each other in the dust and silence of the Wild West and discovered that sometimes saving someone else is the only way to save yourself. I invite you to stay with me for this journey. Let your heart walk beside theirs. If this story touches you, please like this video and subscribe to help our channel reach 1,000 subscribers. And when you're done, share your thoughts in the comments. Now, let us ride into the heart of the story. The Arizona Territory, summer of 1885. The sun was a white-hot coin nailed high in the empty sky, beating down on the land like it meant to burn it bare. Elias Boone guided his chestnut gelding along a narrow wash between the rock walls, the saddle creaking beneath him. He'd been riding since dawn, the smell of dust and sage thick in the air. It was the kind of heat that baked the ground until it cracked, the kind that made a man think twice before drawing a deep breath. The trail was quiet, no bird song, only the scrape of his horse's shoes against the stone and the low groan of wind pushing through the canyon. He'd ridden this stretch dozens of times, and it never gave him much more than solitude. That was the point. But today, something made him pull the reins without thinking. A shadow on the far side of the wash, small, still, and wrong. Elias squinted against the glare. At first, it looked like nothing more than a weathered post driven into the ground. Then he saw the dark shape slumped against it. He felt the air leave his lungs. It was a woman. The distance between them was about 100 yards, but even from here he could see her skin burned raw on one shoulder, the fabric of her dress torn and stiff with dirt. Her head drooped forward, black hair tangled over her face, and circling above vultures. 4 of them, black wings catching the light as they wheeled lazily in the hot air. Elias clicked his tongue to urge the gelding forward, the horse's ears flicking at the smell carried on the wind. As he closed the distance, more details came into focus. Her hands were bound behind the post with rough cord. Her feet, one bare, one in a cracked moccasin, were swollen and caked with dust. The deer hide of her dress hung awkwardly over her, the side seam ripped nearly to the waist. She wasn't dead. He could see it now. Her chest moved, shallow but steady, and her head shifted just enough to let him glimpse one dark, half-lidded eye. It wasn't the look of someone pleading. It was the look of someone past pleading, someone who'd already decided there was no help coming. Elias swung down from the saddle, boots crunching against the gravel, the heat pressed against his back, sweat trickling down his neck as he took the rifle from its scabbard, letting it hang loosely in one hand. Old habits always check before getting close. His eyes swept the surrounding rocks. No horses, no riders, no sign of a camp or wagon. Whoever left her here had been gone long enough for the vultures to get bold. He stepped closer, the air between them carrying the scorched scent of sunburnt skin mixed with the sour tang of thirst. A gust lifted her hair, revealing the edge of her cheek. The skin there was raw and red where the sun had cracked it. Flies buzzed near the corners of her mouth, and he saw the fine tremor in her jaw when she tried to move it. Her gaze met his for half a heartbeat, long enough for him to see something in her eyes that stopped him cold. Not fear, not hope, just the last stubborn thread of will holding on. Elias didn't think about it. His knife was already in his hand. "Easy now," he muttered, the words more for himself than for her. He moved behind the post, crouched, and began sawing at the cord. The rope was pulled tight, biting deep into her wrists. When it finally gave, her body collapsed forward. He caught her before she hit the dirt. She weighed less than he'd expected, her frame all bone and heat under his arms. For a moment she rested against his chest, her breath rasping near his ear. Then her head lolled to the side, and he realized she was barely conscious at all. "Come on," he said quietly, shifting her weight to lift her. He carried her to the gelding, the horse sidestepping at the strange smell. Elias murmured low to settle him, then draped her carefully across the saddle. He tied a loose strap around her waist to keep her steady before mounting up behind her. The sun burned against his shoulders as he turned the horse toward the distant line of pines, the start of the Chiricahua foothills. It would be a long ride back to his camp, and the heat wasn't going to ease before nightfall. He glanced down at her once more. Her eyes were closed, lips cracked, breath barely lifting her chest. There'd be time for questions later if she made it that far. He set his jaw, nudged the horse into a steady gait, and let the canyon walls swallow them from the sight of the circling birds. The gelding's hooves struck the baked earth with a steady rhythm, each step jarring the woman's limp form against Elias's chest. He kept one arm wrapped around her waist, the other steady on the reins, urging the horse up the narrow trail that led toward the pines. The heat clung to him, thick as wet wool. The canyon stone walls threw the sunlight back in sharp, blinding bursts, and each gust of wind carried dust that stung his eyes and coated his tongue. She was fever-hot, even through the thin leather of his gloves. Her head lolled against his collarbone, hair damp with sweat, sticking to his shirt. Every so often, a faint tremor passed through her body. They reached the first stand of pines after nearly an hour. The shade was a blessing. Cooler air slid down from the higher ridges, and the smell of sap replaced the dry, acrid sting of the desert floor. But the trail grew steeper, cutting into the side of the mountain. The gelding's breathing grew heavier, and Elias leaned forward, murmuring low, "Easy. Boy, we're close." They passed over a ridge where the wind whipped hard enough to sway the treetops. Elias squinted, scanning the trail ahead. A fallen pine blocked part of the path, its trunk blackened from an old lightning strike. He guided the gelding around, careful not to jostle the woman more than necessary. By the time they reached his camp in the Chiricahua Mountains, the sun had dipped behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the clearing. The small log cabin sat tucked between tall pines, its chimney already dark with years of smoke. Beside it, a lean-to shelter and a stone fire pit waited, as constant as the mountain itself. Elias swung down slowly, keeping her steady as he dismounted. Her weight sagged against him when he lifted her from the saddle, legs too weak to take her own weight. "Got you," he murmured, more to fill the silence than because she could hear him. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and old tobacco. A cot stood against the far wall, its wool blanket neatly folded at the foot. He laid her down carefully, easing the blanket over her. Her skin was flushed, sweat beating at her temples. The cracked leather cord at her wrists had left deep grooves in the skin, raw and red. Elias crouched by the small iron stove in the corner, stacking kindling with practiced hands. Soon, a flame caught, licking at the dry wood until the fire grew steady. The pop of resin and the low hum of heat filled the room. He set a dented kettle on the stove, filling it with water from the tin pail he kept near the door. While it warmed, he took a clean rag from a shelf and dipped it in the basin, wringing out the excess. The first touch of the cool cloth against her forehead made her flinch faintly. a crease forming between her brows. "It's all right," he said softly. "You're safe here." She didn't open her eyes. When the kettle began to steam, he poured a small measure into a tin cup, letting it cool until it was just warm. Sliding one arm behind her shoulders, he lifted her enough to press the cup to her lips. "Drink," he urged. At first, there was nothing. Then, a shallow swallow. Another. She drank in slow, halting sips, her throat working like each swallow was an effort. He eased her back down, covering her again. The fever was strong, but the water would help. He pulled the chair closer to the cot and sat, resting his elbows on his knees. The firelight flickered across her face, softening the sharp lines of exhaustion. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the stove ticking as it heated and the wind sighing outside. Then her lips moved, barely a whisper, hoarse and cracked. Why Elias leaned forward. What her eyes opened just enough for him to see the dark irises beneath the swollen lids. Why? Help, he let out a slow breath. Because no one deserves to die like that, he said simply. Her gaze searched his face for a moment, as if weighing the truth in his voice. Then her eyes slid shut again, and her breathing eased into a shallow rhythm. Elias stayed there for a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest, until the kettle hissed again. He refreshed the cloth on her forehead, then leaned back in the chair. Outside, the mountain wind shifted, bringing the scent of distant rain. But inside the small cabin, the air was warm, and for the first time all day, the shadow of the vultures felt far away. The night passed in fits and starts. Every so often, Elias would wake to check the fire, dampen the cloth on her forehead, or tilt the cup to her lips. By the time a pale stripe of dawnlight slipped between the shutters, the fever had eased enough that her breathing no longer rattled in her chest. When Elias opened the door to fetch water from the spring, the mountain air bit at his skin, sharp and cold after the heat of the day before. He poured the water into the pail, listening to the murmur of the stream and the first bird calls in the pines. For the first time since he'd found her, the place felt less like a refuge for one man and more like it had another pulse within it. Inside, she was awake, though she hadn't moved from the cot. Her dark eyes followed him as he set the pail down. "You're still here," he said, more observation than question. Her voice was rough. "I couldn't walk if I tried." He gave a small nod, setting a tin mug of water on the stool beside her. "Drink as much as you can." She pushed herself up slowly. The blanket clutched around her shoulders. She drank in careful sips, never looking away from him. When the mug was empty, she lowered it to her lap. "My name is Nayeli." Elias paused. "Nayeli," he repeated, letting the sound settle. "Elias Boone." She nodded once, eyes dropping to the frayed edge of the blanket. After a moment, she spoke again. "My people. They said I carry sickness, that I brought death into the camp." He waited. There was fever. Old ones died. A child. Her fingers tightened on the blanket. "I wasn't sick, but they said the spirits cursed me, that I was unclean." Elias's jaw shifted. "So they left you out there. They tied me at night. In the morning, they took me to the stones." Her voice thinned, almost disappearing. They walked away before the sun touched the ground. Silence filled the cabin. The stove ticked as the fire settled, and outside, wind scraped along the roof. "They were wrong," he said finally. Her eyes lifted, searching his face again. "You don't know me. I know what I saw," he replied, "and what I didn't see." She didn't answer, but her gaze lingered a fraction longer before sliding away. The days that followed took on a rhythm. Elias moved through the work he'd always done, checking the traps strung along the creek, skinning rabbits and squirrels, stretching the pelts on wooden frames to dry in the thin mountain air. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and leather. In the evenings, he sat near the fire, mending worn seams in his coat or stitching new patches onto the knees of his trousers. The hiss of the needle through cloth was as familiar as the crack of twigs outside. Nayeli watched him work, though she kept her distance. She rarely spoke unless he asked her something directly, and even then her answers were short, measured. When she moved about the cabin, her steps were quiet, almost soundless, as if she were still in a place where every noise might be taken as a threat. Sometimes she would glance toward the door, her brow tightening for reasons she didn't share. Elias noticed, but he didn't press. He'd learned long ago that some truths couldn't be pulled, only offered. One afternoon, as he returned from checking the line of traps, he found her standing near the table, fingers brushing the haft of his hunting knife, not gripping it, just tracing the worn wood as if weighing its history. "You hunt every day?" she asked without turning. "Most days," he said, setting the day's catch, a pair of rabbits on the counter. "Keeps the meat fresh, and the work keeps me steady." Her gaze flicked to him. What did you do before he hesitated, gutting the first rabbit with a slow, sure cut? Soldier, cavalry, she considered that for a moment. War, he confirmed, and after he wiped the blade clean before answering, after Missouri, wife, daughter. The words came out flat, but his hands slowed, lost them both in a week. Fever took the whole town. Nayeli didn't speak. Elias set the knife down, leaning on the table with both hands. I left after that. Couldn't see much worth staying for. He didn't look at her, but he could feel her watching him. "That's why you stopped?" she asked softly. He met her eyes. Maybe. The quiet between them wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, but it carried something more than suspicion, now something closer to understanding. By the week's end, Nayeli was moving more on her own, though she still tired quickly. She began folding the blankets each morning, tidying the table without being asked. Elias caught her once at the window, her fingers brushing the rough wood of the frame as she watched the light shift over the mountains. She didn't notice him at first, and in that unguarded moment, her face was softer, less guarded. When she turned and saw him, the mask slipped back into place, but not as tightly as before. In the quiet of those early days, trust didn't come all at once. It came in the way she accepted the cup from his hand without flinching, in the way she let her eyes rest on his a moment longer before looking away, in the way she lingered by the fire in the evenings instead of retreating to the cot. And for Elias, it came in the way he found himself listening for the small sounds she made, the rustle of fabric, the scrape of a chair, and realizing that the cabin didn't feel as empty anymore. The days after that first night settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, one that neither of them planned, but which seemed to grow naturally, like grass between stones. By the second morning, Nayeli could stand without swaying too much. The fever had broken, though her skin still carried the heat of recovery. Elias noticed the change when she insisted on stepping outside to feel the sun, not the punishing blaze that had nearly killed her, but the softened warmth of early morning, filtered through the tall pines. She began to take on small tasks, the sort that didn't strain her still mending body. She folded the hides Elias had left out to cure, smoothing their edges with careful fingers. When he came back from checking the snares, he found her crouched by the lashing pole, examining the knots he'd tied to stretch the skins. She didn't ask questions, but she memorized the way the cords looped. In the afternoons, When the shadows lengthened, she sat by the lopsided table stitching a tear in his spare shirt. Elias, working at the other end of the camp, would hear the soft rhythm of the needle passing through cloth, and it reminded him of a home he hadn't had in years. The thread she used was rough, salvaged from an old saddlebag, but her stitches were straight, neat, almost tender in their precision. They spoke little. Words came like the trickle of the creek nearby, quiet, measured, and rare. Elias told her about the best places to set rabbit snares in these woods. She told him, almost in a whisper, the names of the birds that passed overhead. Sometimes the talk ended there, each retreating into the company of their own thoughts. But Elias began to notice things, small things. Each night before she lay down on the bedroll, Nayeli's eyes would drift to the tent flap. It wasn't a casual glance. It was a measured check, the way a person counts doors in a room before deciding where to stand. Her hand often lingered on the edge of the blanket, as if ready to pull it over herself like a shield. Once, a branch cracked in the wind just outside. She stiffened instantly, her breath caught. Elias saw her eyes sharpen, like an animal that had learned too many times that sounds in the dark meant danger. He spoke softly from across the space. "It's just the wind through the cedars. Nothing more." She nodded once, but her gaze stayed fixed on the opening for a long while before she lay down again. One late afternoon, while Elias was scraping the last bit of flesh from a deer hide, Nayeli approached quietly. "Show me," she said, motioning toward the tool in his hand. He passed her the curved scraper, guiding her fingers into position. Her hands were smaller, but strong enough to work the edge along the hide. The sound, rough leather against steel, was steady and unhurried. When she finished, she looked at him briefly, the corner of her mouth twitching upward. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was the first time her expression had softened in his presence. That evening, they shared a stew of rabbit meat and wild onions. She ate slowly, still unused to more than a few bites at a time, but her eyes followed his hands as he ladled the food, as if she were memorizing every step in case she needed to do it herself. As the fire burned low, she set her bowl aside and spoke, her voice even but carrying a weight he didn't miss. "If I go," she said, "I die." He met her gaze, waiting. "If I stay." She hesitated, as though measuring the risk of the next words. Elias leaned forward slightly, the firelight catching in his eyes. "Stay as long as you want," he said. "No debt between us." She didn't answer right away. Her gaze drifted toward the tent flap again, then back to the flames. Finally, she gave a single, small nod. Outside, the wind shifted through the pines, carrying the scent of distant rain. Inside, they sat in the glow of the fire. Two strangers who had not yet decided what they would be to each other. Only that. For tonight, neither of them was alone. And though neither said it, both felt something unspoken settle between them, the first fragile thread of trust. The morning air was thin and cool when Elias saddled his bay gelding, brushing the dust from the leather with slow, deliberate strokes. Nayeli stood near the doorway of the pine frame cabin, wrapped in a faded shawl he'd given her, watching his hands work. "We'll need flour, coffee, salt," he said, tightening the cinch strap, "and you'll need boots before the cold sets in." Her gaze flickered toward the narrow trail that wound down the ridge, disappearing into the wide valley beyond. "How far?" she asked quietly. 6 miles to Dry Gulch," he replied. 2 hours if we take it steady." When they set out, the sun had barely cleared the canyon rim. The trail sloped down through tall pines before opening into rolling scrubland, dotted with mesquite and sage. A dry wind carried the smell of dust and something faintly metallic iron in the soil. Elias guessed. Nayeli sat behind him, her hands resting lightly at first on his coat, then firmer as the trail narrowed over a rocky ledge. She didn't speak, but he could feel her tension in the way her breath quickened each time the horse's hooves slid on loose gravel. "You'll be fine," he said over his shoulder. "Just keep hold." The closer they came to town, the less wild the land felt. A split rail fence appeared on the horizon, then a windmill, its blades turning with a low groan. Soon the faint sound of hammering drifted on the air, joined by the bray of a mule. Dry Gulch was nothing more than a main street with 24 buildings, weathered false fronts, a saloon with swinging doors, a livery, and a general store with a wide plank porch. Dust swirled with each gust, lifting scraps of paper and grit into the air. Elias slowed the horse to a walk as eyes began to turn their way. A woman in a calico dress paused at the pump, watching. Two men leaned against a hitching rail, their conversation fading into silence. Curiosity mixed with something harder, an edge Nayeli recognized too well. She lowered her gaze, focusing on the horse's mane, but the murmurs carried just enough for her to catch pieces. Apache girl with Boone shouldn't be here. At the far end of the street, 3 men stepped down from the saloon porch as Elias dismounted. They were broad-shouldered, dust on their boots, the kind of men who looked for trouble when the day was slow. "Boone," one called, his voice lazy but sharp at the edges. "Didn't know you'd taken to bringing pets into town." Nayeli's grip on the saddle horn tightened, her knuckles pale. Elias turned to face them fully, his voice even but carrying. "Careful with your words." The man smirked. "Just saying folks don't like her kind around here." "She's my wife," Elias said, each word deliberate. "Anyone with a problem can take it up with me." The street went quieter than the inside of a church. The leader's smirk faltered just enough to notice, but he stepped back, muttering something under his breath. His friends followed, glancing once more before disappearing into the saloon's shadow. Elias turned back to Nayeli. "Come on." Inside the general store, the air smelled of kerosene and dried beans. A bearded man behind the counter glanced up, his eyes landing on Nayeli before shifting to Elias. "We'll need 20 pounds of flour, coffee beans, a pound of salt, and a pair of women's boots, size 6 if you've got 'em," Elias said. The shopkeeper hesitated only a beat before moving to fill the order. Nayeli's eyes roamed the shelves, rows of tin lanterns, jars of penny candy, bolts of calico in faded blues and reds. Her hand drifted toward a small box of sewing needles, her fingers brushing the smooth wood. Elias noticed. "Add that to the list," he told the shopkeeper. She looked up at him, a question in her eyes. He only nodded. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the street's eyes followed them again. Elias didn't hurry, leading the horse to the trough before helping Nayeli mount. The moment they cleared the last building and the open land spread before them, she let out a breath she'd been holding since they rode in. "You shouldn't have said that," she murmured. "Said what?" "That I was your wife." He glanced over his shoulder. It was the truth I needed them to hear. The trail home felt longer in the afternoon heat. Grasshoppers clicked in the brush, and the horse's shadow stretched long over the ground. Nayeli's arms tightened around his waist, not from fear now, but something steadier. Halfway up the ridge, she spoke again. "In my village, no man would have stood like that. Not for me." Elias didn't answer right away. Then they weren't worth standing for. When they reached the cabin, the light was slanting gold through the pines. Elias unloaded the supplies while Nayeli poured water into a basin, rinsing the dust from her hands. She didn't look at him when she spoke next. "Maybe," she said softly. This place isn't just a place to hide. He met her gaze then, the faintest hint of a smile in his eyes. It was never meant to be. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and wood smoke. Inside, the air felt different, less like a shelter from the world, more like the beginning of one. The days after their trip to Dry Gulch felt different. The weight in Nayeli's shoulders had eased, and though she still carried herself with the quiet caution of someone used to being watched, there was something else now, small signs of belonging. They began working side by side more often, in the mornings. Elias checked his traps while Nayeli brought in water from the spring, the pail swinging against her leg in an easy rhythm. She set it down by the door, breath rising in faint clouds on colder mornings. One afternoon, they worked together on the roof of the lean-to. The old pine shingles had warped in last winter's storms, and Elias had been meaning to replace them. Nayeli steadied the ladder while he climbed up with a bundle of new shingles tied with twine. She passed them up one by one, her hands quick, her eyes following each movement without the old, defensive wariness. By late morning, the work had settled into a rhythm, the scrape of the hammer claw pulling nails, the thud of new wood settling into place. When Elias came down for a drink, he caught a faint smile on her face. It wasn't directed at him exactly, but at the work itself, the way a task done well can settle into the bones. They started a small garden near the south side of the cabin where the soil was richer. Elias showed her how he'd marked rows with string, planting beans, carrots, and a patch of potatoes. Nayeli knelt in the dirt, pressing seeds into the ground with careful fingers. "Too deep and they'll rot," he told her. She arched a brow at him, but adjusted the next row without comment. When the planting was done, they stood for a moment in the mild afternoon sun, looking over the neat lines of turned earth. It didn't look like much yet, but it was the first thing they'd built together. Evenings became their own kind of ritual. Sometimes Elias cooked a rabbit stew thickened with flour and onions, or cornbread baked in the cast-iron skillet. Other nights, Nayeli took the pot, adding dried herbs she gathered from the hillside. Her hands moved with a memory of other kitchens, other fires, the smells weaving into the cabin's walls. After supper, they sat by the stove. The wind threaded through the pines outside, a low, constant song. Elias mended gear or cleaned his rifle while Nayeli worked at her sewing, the faint scratch of needle and thread punctuating the quiet. It was in those moments, with the firelight on her face and her hair loose over her shoulders, that Elias began to see something more than survival in her. The lines of strain had softened, and her eyes, once sharp and guarded, sometimes held a warmth that caught him off guard. One night, as they finished a meal, Nayeli leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the door. Elias noticed but didn't speak until she turned back to him. "I used to think," she said slowly, "that quiet meant danger. No voices, no movement. It meant something was coming." He set his cup down, and now her lips curved slightly. Now it just means the wind's in the trees. It was the closest she'd come to telling him she felt safe here. As spring deepened, so did the rhythm of their days. Nayeli no longer waited for instruction. She rose early, started the fire, even patched Elias's old wool coat without him asking. When she laughed soft, almost shy, the sound seemed to settle into the cabin's timbers like it had been missing all along. Elias found himself watching her in those unguarded moments, not with the detached courtesy he'd kept at first, but with the quiet recognition of someone who had known loss and was now seeing what it looked like to rebuild not just a shelter, but a life. One evening, as they sat outside after supper, the last light fading over the Chiricahua Mountains, Elias caught himself thinking how natural it felt, 2 chairs. The smell of pine smoke, the creak of the boards under their feet. For the first time in years, the word home didn't feel like a place he'd lost. It felt like something that was slowly, steadily, taking shape right here. The morning began like any other pale light slipping between the shutters, the smell of pine smoke from last night's fire lingering in the cool air. Elias was at the table, cutting strips of leather for a new pair of reins, when he heard her footsteps behind him. He looked up, expecting to see her carrying the water pail from the spring. Instead, Nayeli stood in the doorway, shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. There was something in her face he hadn't seen before, a kind of stillness, as if she'd been carrying a thought all morning and had finally decided to set it down. She stepped closer, took his hand, and placed it gently on her stomach. "I think," she hesitated, her eyes searching his, "there's life." For a moment, the room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the stove. Elias didn't move, his hand resting where she'd placed it, the warmth of her skin rising through the worn cotton of her dress. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "You're sure?" She nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Not in my head. In here." She pressed her other hand over his. He sat back in the chair, letting out a slow breath, then stood and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened for half a heartbeat before sinking against him. "We protect it," he said into her hair, his voice steady. "Together." The news changed the shape of their days. There was still hunting, mending, and tending the garden, but now each task carried an extra purpose, a weight that was both heavy and hopeful. They began to gather what they would need for the months ahead. Elias salvaged cedar planks from an old shed at the edge of the clearing, trimming and sanding them until they were smooth enough to use for a new wall in the lean-to. Nayeli sat by the fire in the evenings, sewing tiny moccasins from soft rabbit hide, her stitches even and sure. "Never made something this small," she said one night, holding up the first finished piece. It fit easily in the palm of her hand. "You'll make 2, Elias replied, smiling. "Otherwise the kid's going to have a hard time walking." She laughed, a sound so rare in the early days that Elias still caught himself stopping to listen when it came. They expanded the garden, turning over more earth on the south slope where the sun lingered longest. Elias planted corn in neat rows, while Nayeli followed, pressing each seed into place and covering it with a small mound of soil. "Corn grows tall," Elias said, patting the dirt with the flat of his palm. "Tall enough to break the wind, and to hide in," Nayeli added, half teasing. When the work was done, they stood together at the edge of the rows, the air warm with the smell of sun-baked soil. For the first time in months, Elias allowed himself to picture a season ahead that wasn't just about survival, but about growth roots going deeper, walls standing stronger. The preparations continued into the early summer. Elias reinforced the cabin's door, fitted new hinges, and patched the chinks in the walls with fresh mortar. He built a cradle from pine boards, sanding the edges until they were smooth as river stones. Nayeli lined it with soft cloth she'd pieced together from old shirts, the faded colors blending into something warm and gentle. Some nights, they sat outside under the stars, talking about names. Elias suggested Sarah, after his mother. Nayeli said she liked the sound, but wanted to wait, to see the child's face before deciding. There were moments when the weight of the unknown pressed in questions about what lay beyond their clearing, whether the world would ever leave them in peace. But those thoughts came and went like passing clouds. What stayed was the quiet certainty that they were no longer two people trying to outrun the past. Now, they were building something worth standing still for. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the Chiricahua Mountains and the sky blushed with the last light, Elias watched Nayeli move about the cabin, her shadow swaying across the walls. She paused at the window, looking out over the garden, then turned to meet his gaze. For the first time since he'd found her in that sun-blasted canyon, he saw not just survival in her eyes, but a steady, unshaken hope. And he knew then, whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The summer night was heavy with heat, the kind that clung to the skin even after the fire had died down. Outside, the wind had gone still, and the pines stood silent against a sky scattered with stars. Elias woke to the sound of movement, quick, sharp, not the slow turn of someone shifting in their sleep. He pushed himself up on one elbow and saw Nayeli sitting on the edge of the bedroll, her back to him, shoulders rigid. Her breath came in short bursts, almost a sob, but without sound. He rose quietly, crossing the few steps between them. Nayeli. She didn't turn. Her hands were gripping the blanket so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. When she finally looked over her shoulder, her face was damp, hair clinging to her temples. "I saw it," she whispered. "Again." He knew without asking what she meant. "They tied my wrists, left me in the sun. I could feel the heat burning my skin, hear the wings." Her voice broke, and she pressed her hands over her ears as if to block out the sound. "I woke before they walked away this time, but I knew they would." Elias knelt in front of her, taking her wrists gently, lowering her hands. "Look at me," he said, his voice low but firm. When she did, he held her gaze. "No one's taking you from here." Her eyes searched his, and for a moment, something in her seemed to want to believe him entirely. But then her gaze shifted, as if the weight of memory was heavier than his words. That night, she lay back down, but sleep didn't come quickly. Elias stayed awake beside her, listening to the uneven rhythm of her breathing. He'd known fear before on battlefields, in the dark halls of army hospitals, but this was different. This was the fear of losing something you had no right to lose again. When his wife and daughter had died back in Missouri, the grief had been a raw, gaping thing, swallowing every reason to stay in that town. He'd told himself he was done with ties, done with needing anyone. But now, with Nayeli beside him and a new life stirring within her, he felt the same fragility pressing at the edges. The thought of her being taken by force, by sickness, by the ghosts that still haunted her dreams, twisted in his gut like a blade. The days that followed carried the same rhythm as before garden work, checking traps, mending the roof where the summer storms had loosened shingles. But Elias noticed the small changes. Nayeli was quieter, her eyes drifting toward the tree line more often. When the wind carried the sound of wings overhead, hawks or crows, she would stop what she was doing, her hand instinctively going to her stomach. One afternoon, as they worked side by side in the garden, Elias paused, leaning on the handle of the hoe. "You've been looking over your shoulder more," he said. She didn't meet his gaze. Old habits. He studied her for a long moment. Or old fears. She pressed her lips together but didn't answer. That night, he found her sitting by the stove long after supper, staring into the embers. "You know," he began, settling into the chair opposite her, "I used to think about what I'd do if I'd gotten there sooner. Back then, with my daughter." Her eyes lifted to his. "I thought maybe I could have kept her safe. That if I'd been faster, stronger, something, she'd still be here." He shook his head. "But the truth is, we can't change what's behind us. We only get to fight for what's in front of us." Nayeli's fingers tightened around her cup. "And if what's behind us finds us here?" Elias leaned forward. his voice steady. Then, "We fight harder." They sat in the quiet that followed, the only sound the faint hiss of the fire. Outside, the wind had returned, threading through the pines with a low sigh. When they finally went to bed, Nayeli lay with her back against him, and for the first time in days, her breathing fell into an even rhythm before sleep took her. Elias stayed awake a while longer, his hand resting lightly over hers. He knew the past wasn't done with either of them, but he also knew this, if it came knocking, it would find two people standing together, not one left to face the sun alone. The first snow came early that year. By late November, the pines were heavy with white, and the air carried the crisp scent of wood smoke from the stove. The days were shorter, the nights longer and quieter, broken only by the crackle of logs in the fire and the faint creak of the cabin's timbers in the cold. On one such night, Elias sat near the stove with his pocket knife, a small block of cedar in his hands. He worked slowly, the shavings curling away to fall into a growing pile at his boots. The scent of the fresh-cut wood mingled with the warmth of the fire, filling the cabin with something familiar and comforting. Nayeli was seated across from him, mending a pair of wool socks. Her belly had rounded under her dress, the child inside making its presence known with small, rolling movements. She paused now and then, resting her hands against her stomach as if to still it. Her eyes had been following the movement of his hands for some time before she spoke. "What are you making?" Elias didn't look up immediately. A toy, something for little hands to hold. She set the sock aside, leaning forward slightly. What kind of toy? He turned the piece in his hand so she could see. It was beginning to take the shape of a small horse, the legs still rough but the curve of the neck already smooth. "You've made this before," she said. He nodded once, the knife pausing. "I made one a long time ago." The quiet stretched between them, filled only by the sound of the wind brushing against the shutters. Then she asked, softly, "What was her name?" Elias kept his eyes on the wooden horse, but his voice was steady when he answered, "Clara." Nayeli's gaze lingered on him for a long moment. Then she said, with the kind of quiet certainty that left no room for doubt, "Then this one will be Clara, too." He looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no pity in her expression, no hesitation, only the simple offering of a name, a bridge between the child he had lost and the one they were waiting to meet. They didn't speak after that. There was no need. Elias went back to his carving, the knife moving with more care now, as if each stroke was part of some small act of mending. Nayeli picked up her sewing again, her hands steady, her eyes softened by the glow of the fire. Outside, snow drifted down in slow, deliberate flakes, settling over the roof and the branches of the pines. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the usual rustle of animals muted under the thickening blanket. Inside, the firelight flickered against the walls, casting long, swaying shadows. The warmth wrapped around them like a quilt, warding off the cold that pressed against the cabin from all sides. Elias finished shaping the horse's head and ran his thumb along the grain. He imagined small fingers curling around it, the sound of a child's laughter in the cabin. The thought no longer carried the sharp sting it once did. Instead, it felt like a promise, fragile, but real. When he glanced at Nayeli again, she was watching the snow through the small window, her lips curved in a faint smile. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, as if she were holding two lives there, her own, and the one just beginning. Later, when the fire burned low, and the cabin was lit only by its embers. Elias set the wooden horse on the mantel. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the shutters. but inside there was only the slow, steady rhythm of their breathing. He sat beside her on the bedroll, the worn blanket pulled up around them. For a while they simply listened to the wind, to the settling of the logs, to the faint creak of the old timbers. Elias thought about the years between the last time he'd held a carving knife for a child's toy and tonight, about the hollow places he'd carried, and how, somehow, this small cabin in the pines had begun to fill them. He reached for her hand, and she let him take it, her fingers curling into his. In the quiet, with the snow falling and the fire's warmth fading to embers, it felt less like the end of a day and more like the beginning of something they both thought they'd lost the chance to have. Winter loosened its grip slowly, as if reluctant to let go. The snow melted first in the open spaces, revealing the reddish earth beneath. Then, along the banks of the creek, where the ice thinned to glass before breaking apart into rushing water. By late March, green shoots of corn pushed through the rows they had planted the previous summer. The garden, once a patch of turned earth, was alive with the promise of food and color. The air carried the smell of damp soil and pine resin, and the wind was warmer now, coming down from the Chiricahua Mountains without the bite of frost. Elias stood at the edge of the garden, one hand resting on the handle of the hoe, watching Nayeli move among the rows. Her dress was loose around her shoulders, but full at the middle, and every step she took seemed deliberate, as though she was walking in rhythm with the small life she carried. They had been through storms, through nights when the wind sounded like voices from the past, through mornings when the weight of memory pressed heavy on their chests. But the days ahead were different. They were no longer simply surviving. They were preparing. A few days before the due date, Elias repaired the cradle one last time, sanding the edges until they were smooth as bone. Nayeli lined it with the quilt she'd finished in February, stitched from scraps of old shirts and dresses, every square a piece of something that had been worn, used, and loved. That evening, as the sun sank low over the ridge, Elias sat with her on the porch, the boards warm under their boots, the sound of the creek carried up from below, mixed with the occasional call of a bird. "You nervous?" he asked. She glanced at him, the faintest smile touching her lips. "A little. You more than I thought I'd be." He reached for her hand. "But we'll be ready. 2 days later, just after dawn." Nayeli's labor began. The hours that followed blurred into a rhythm of breath and effort, of Elias's steady voice and her determined silence. When the child finally came a girl, her cry sharp and strong, it was as if the whole cabin exhaled. Elias held her first, his large hands cradling the impossibly small bundle. "Clara," he said softly, the name filling the space between them like a blessing. He handed her to Nayeli, who took the child as if she had been waiting her whole life for that moment. The storm of labor passed, leaving a stillness that felt almost sacred. Outside, the sun broke over the mountains, casting a warm light through the cabin's small window. In the days that followed, they fell into a new rhythm. Clara slept in the cradle by the bed, waking with small, searching cries that brought Nayeli from sleep without hesitation. Elias fetched water, kept the fire going, and watched them both with the kind of quiet awe he didn't put into words. There were moments when the past threatened to intrude, when the sound of wings overhead would make Nayeli pause, or when Elias would glance at Clara and remember another child's face. But those moments no longer rooted themselves in fear. Instead, they became reminders of why they guarded this life so fiercely. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Clara sleeping in a basket nearby, Elias found himself saying aloud what had been with him since the day they met. "No one deserves to die alone," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach her across the row. Nayeli looked up from the corn she was checking, her hair catching the sunlight. And sometimes, he added, the ones most broken are the ones who save each other. She didn't answer with words, but the way her eyes softened told him she understood. That evening, as the sun slipped low and the light turned to gold, they took a walk beyond the cabin. Clara was swaddled against Nayeli's chest, her small breaths warm against the fabric. Elias held Nayeli's free hand as they made their way to the open stretch of earth beyond the pines. The sky was wide and unbroken, the mountains standing dark against the horizon. The ground beneath them was rich with the red of Arizona earth, soft from the spring thaw. Their shadows stretched long in the fading light, 2 figures and the smallest third between them. They stood there for a while, saying nothing. Words felt unnecessary. Everything they had been through, loss, fear, the long road back to trust was held in the simple fact that they were here, together, and no one was taking that from them. When they finally turned back toward the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the ridge, but the warmth lingered in the air, and, for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to brace against. It felt like something worth walking toward, step by steady step, hand in hand. In the dust and silence of the frontier, Elias and Nayeli's journey teaches us something timeless. Strength is not measured by how much we can endure alone, but by how willing we are to stand for someone else. Both carried wounds the world could not see: loss, betrayal, fear, and yet, when their paths crossed, they chose to protect, to trust, and to rebuild.
For those of us who have seen many seasons pass, this story is a reminder that it is never too late to find purpose again. The past will always leave its marks, but it does not have to define the rest of the trail. Even in the harshest places, kindness can take root. Even in the most weathered hearts, hope can bloom again. We may not all ride through the Arizona territory or face the dangers of the Wild West, but each of us meets moments where we can choose turn away or lean in to help. And when we choose compassion, we do more than change another life. We find our own heart mended in the process, because sometimes the ones most broken are the ones who save each other. Thank you, friends, for spending your time with us and walking alongside Elias and Nayeli's journey. If this story touched your heart, please give it a like, share it with someone who might need its message, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and bring more voices from the Wild West back to life. Together, let's reach 1,000 subscribers and keep the echoes of the past alive for generations to come.